is being recorded.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for your patience while we got this started. We had a switch of WebEx accounts, and so it has just complicated our login process on our end. So our dearest apologies to everyone. This is Jenny Olmstead with Department of Children, Youth, and Families, and I also have Sarah Winkleman here. So we'll be navigating the PowerPoint for Mia as they work through their presentation. If everyone could just please mute themselves as we move forward, that would be great. We are also recording the webinar, so this will be available after this webinar ends, and it will be uploaded to our website so you guys can access it. So Mia, I'm not sure if you guys have everything that you need on your end. I just want to do a check-in as I know we were delayed with getting you all being able to be oriented to WebEx. So just let us. Are we muted? Can you guys hear us?
Yes, we can. Hello, everybody. This is Mia Edidin. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Great. So if everybody could mute yourself. So on the bottom left of your screen, there's like an old-fashioned microphone looking icon. Please hit that and it'll go from black to red. That is a good sign when that happens. Okay. So there will be some time for question and answer at the end. So it will probably be best to keep yourself muted for the entirety of the presentation. And then at the end, when we ask for question and answer, then you can unmute yourself, ask your question, and then it's helpful to put yourself back on mute to hear the response. It's the best way to keep the webinar as quiet and as easy to hear for everybody. So welcome, everybody. This is a really exciting project that we are working on with the Department of Children, Youth, and Families. It's part of a larger project called the Perinatal Mental Health Initiative. And one of the things that we are doing as part of this initiative is a webinar series. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, and I will introduce Maylene in just a moment. Jenny, are you all going to forward our slides for us, or we have access?
We'll go ahead and take care of that if you just let us know when you want to move slides.
Okay. So if you could forward the slide, that would be great. And I'm actually going to put my video on so you all can see me. There you go. Hi, everybody. So my name is Mia Edidin. I am the Clinical Director at Perinatal Support Washington. And I'm just going to do a quick introduction about some of the work that we're doing with the Department of Children, Youth, and Family. And then we'll move into the webinar in just a minute. So this larger work that I just mentioned, the Perinatal Mental Health Initiative, is a 2-year pilot project, and it's a collaboration between Perinatal Support Washington and the Department of Children, Youth, and Family Services, specifically the Strengthening Families Washington team. Go ahead and forward. So this work that we're doing is prevention services and capacity building. It's child abuse and neglect prevention dollars, so it's federal CAPTA funding. funding. And the overall goal of this work is to support community-based efforts to develop responses to the perinatal mental health need. So one of the things that we really were hoping to do with this project was to help communities identify the gaps in services that they were experiencing and work to close those gaps. So rather than coming in with sort of a, these are the things that every community needs to do to address perinatal mental health, it was really allowing a lot of opportunity for communities to really identify the gaps in care and also identify the goals and some of the work that they might do to address those. Next slide. So an overview of the work is laid out in this slide, and we've kind of divided it into several layers and several ways that people can connect with this work. So the project funded sort of universal training for providers across the state, no matter where you lived, and try to really bring access to communities that haven't had it before. So trying to get out of doing all the trainings in Seattle, for instance, as an example. And so over the course of the 2 years, we did one training in South Seattle. We did a training in Spokane. I'll give you more information, but we have a training coming up that's in the Tri-Cities area. It's a 2-day training on perinatal mental health. And then later this spring, we'll be hosting another training that we think will be, in the southwest of the state, so maybe in the Olympia area. We also have done a series of webinars over the past 2 years. Topics have been things like looking at how support groups work to support families during the perinatal period. We looked at the kind of population-based prevalence rates, looking at the implications of poverty and trauma, and looking at why some communities might experience a higher level of perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. We did one on dads earlier this fall. All of the webinars are available on the Perinatal Support Washington webinar or website. This webinar is obviously part of that webinar series. We also have another coming up in March I'll tell you about in just a moment. The next level of work that this funding provided was the opportunity for communities to apply for funding to really take a very focused approach to addressing the perinatal mental health need in their communities. And so 7 communities applied and received funding. And what those communities did was they came together and created what we called perinatal mental health task forces. And that's where some of that community-based kind of discussions and goal setting and collaborative work really happened. So those communities identified what their communities needed, they created a work plan, and they worked towards addressing the gaps in their community. Part of that work was to bring trainings to all 7 of those communities. Part of that work was to train and support organizations to start perinatal mental health support groups in all of those communities, and then also to create resource and referral guides so that families and providers all had access to the perinatal mental health resources, which helped kind of address that piece of, I'm not really sure where to send people once I've identified who they need, which we really hear from all professionals around the state, that they're really, wanting to support families, but they don't really know where the resources are. And so we really tried to think of ways to help connect the dots. So the overall goals were to increase community capacity. So that looked like training more providers, having support groups in the communities, and then having easy pathways. So that was that resource and referral guide. It was the connections and the collaborations that was made in the task forces where providers from cross sectors came together. So like OB and mental health and early learning were all in the same meeting together or at the same trainings together, and they could create pathways to refer families between their programs. And then the last piece, that intensive high quality support. One of the things that we know that all communities need is very high quality perinatal mental health resources. And we know that there's not enough. And this project is not actually trying to necessarily create the mental health pathways for families to get care. This project is really trying to help whole communities come together and talk about what it is that they need and to create more awareness around perinatal mental health. And we know that, we need to work towards training more mental health providers and having more mental health pathways for families to get care. And we hope that that will come. Next slide, please. So the outcome goals, I talked a little bit about this already, but it's to increase capacity within communities so that communities can recognize and support and refer families to appropriate perinatal mood and anxiety resources, right, to identify individuals and organizations that interact with families across contexts in the community. So one of the things we wanted to do was not just have service providers be at the table, but have all of the folks that interact with childbearing people at the table to increase awareness, to increase kind of training in sort of what perinatal mental health is, and that they know how to refer families for care. And then, like I talked about before, the easy pathways for families to be screened for perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. Next slide. So upcoming trainings, all of these are available on the Perinatal Support Washington website. So our next training is January 30th and 31st. It's in Tri-Cities, and it's a 2-day training on perinatal mental health called Best Practices in Prevention, Identification, and Treatment of Perinatal Mood and Anxiety Disorders. On March 2nd, we'll have another webinar in this series on the perinatal mental health experience of Indigenous women in Washington State. And more trainings to come, but those are our 2 scheduled right now. Next slide. So without further ado, I would very excited to introduce Mylene Velasquez. She is a licensed clinical social worker here in Washington, and she will be sharing this webinar with you today. Mylene, welcome.
Hi, I had to unmute myself. I'm very, very excited to be here, and I'm actually excited to hear a little bit about some of the initiatives of Perinatal Support Washington. I'm fairly new to the state. I arrived April of last year, so it's going to be close to a year. But I am a licensed clinical social worker. I'm also certified in perinatal mental health, and I'm a registered play therapist, which is a little bit of where I started my first love in the field and how I found my way to perinatal mental health. So I'm hoping that today's webinar would be very useful for those of us that are working with diverse populations. We know that our communities are changing, and it's important that we look at what is it that we need to do as clinicians, as providers, as advocates to ensure that we are appropriately supporting the people that are coming to us. If we can move to the next slide. Thank you. So some of the goals that I have outlined for us today are to kind of understand a little bit about the prevalence of perinatal mental health population among the Latina population, to understand risk factors and protective factors of kind of what are some of the strengths that our mommies are coming with and how we can use those strengths to support them, to understand some constructs that are prevalent among Latina population, and also to find some ways of supporting mommies that are coming to us within their culture. So we know that there's the greater, larger culture, there's the culture of the family, and then there's the internal culture that each individual carries within them. I think we can move to the next slide. Thank you. So we're going to start with prevalence and looking a bit about what are some things that place mommies at risk and what are some of the statistics and what is the research supporting. Next slide, please. So we know that the rates of perinatal mental health complications among the Latina women are over 50%. And this is what research that I found starting from 2009 up to 2018. It's supporting very high rates for moms. Now, it's something that I really want to mention here is that a lot of the things that I'm going to be going over are applicable to cisgender heterosexual women. So this is important because there hasn't been enough research that has been done among the LGBTQ plus population. And so I want to give that frame so that we keep that in mind as we think about diversity. We also know that less than 15% of all women who experience mental health complications receive treatment. We know specifically that for the Latinx population, there is an underutilization of services, even when we control for things like socioeconomic statuses and when we control for is there access to insurance and care. And so we'll look as we go through the webinar, what are some of the contributors to this fact? And I'm here trying to like move to the next slide. Can you please fast forward to the next one? Thank you. I have to like control myself so I'm not like pressing the button. So Hispanic people or Latinx people, we are the largest ethnic minority in the United States. In 2018, the population of Latino was recorded at close to 1 million, out of which close to 500,000 are the childbearing age. And childbearing age from the census and the CDC is defined as individuals between the age of 15 to 44. It's a pretty large range of population that's coming in either with babies right now or that will be having babies in the near future. This is a 42% increase from the rates in 2010, which were about 200,000. And if there's anybody that's listening from outside of the state of Washington, in the US, there's about 52 million Latino people. So we compose about 16% of the population. And according to the CDC, about 20% of all Latinx women are of that childbearing age between the ages of 15 to 44. So just something to keep in mind as we think about what are the changes that we need to be adjusting for, and what are the changes that are going to be coming to our communities if they're not already present. Next slide, please. So as the population changes, we really need to be mindful to adjust to the demand of those changes. And that might mean very simple things from ensuring that our documentation is in a language that is understandable and preferable to the people that we're serving, to making sure that the interventions that we're using and even ways that we're building rapport with clients are appropriate and meet their individual needs. Next slide, please. So we know that understanding the population and adjusting services to meet their individual needs are gonna have great outcomes society-wise. So we know that in the long term, there's gonna be lower economic costs for our communities. There's gonna be improved outcomes for infants and young children. And there's also going to be early screening and effective treatment of perinatal health complications. I often hear that, for example, when we think about infants 0 to 3, it's a population that's often forgotten about because they're not the population that's bringing in a lot of money. But we know that if we provide early services, that we're going to offset costs for the future. So it's kind of conceptualizing in that way so that when we're speaking to funders or stakeholders, that we have the right wording to ensure that we can properly advocate for the people that we're serving. Next slide, please. And so now we're going to enter into a little bit of the risk factors. And again, just a reminder that as we go through the presentation, a lot of the things that I'm going to be discussing are applicable to heterosexual and cisgender women. Next slide, please. So I found some research from 2017 where the authors explained that Latina immigrant women suffer from higher rates of anxiety and depressive symptoms than their male counterparts, and that are often found to have worse worse mental health outcomes than women in other racial or ethnic groups. So let's look at the next slide and kind of explore a little bit as to how does this come together. We know that Latinx population in the United States is at a disadvantage in terms of socioeconomic statuses. We are found to be among the larger population in lower socioeconomic statuses. There is greater rates of unemployment, greater rates of underemployment, which is defined as not earning enough to to offset the cost of living. I know the cost of living, for example, in Seattle are very, very high. Before moving here, I lived in Miami where the cost of housing were just about as high as here. And so we saw, people earning, for example, $8.50 an hour and not being able to find housing under $1,200. Then the next one is inadequate housing, lack of childcare, migratory status, which can be anything from being undocumented to being in that process of applying to become a documented citizen, discrimination, racism, low mental health treatment engagement, limited access to services, lack of transportation, and insurance and affordable care. One of the benefits in Washington is that I think that we have the Medicaid extension, which is something that we don't have in many other states, that creates a larger complication to people being able to access the care that they need. Next slide, please. So let's look at a little bit of not only risk factors, but what are some of the things that are applicable to social cultural risk factors? One, we know that across the population, there is a huge stigma when it comes to the treatment of mental health and when it comes to experiencing mental health conditions. However, when it comes to the Latina population, there's an extra layer to that where that stigma is a little bit more ingrained within our population. One is the denial of symptoms. And then two is not being able to recognize the symptoms or actually not being aware that there is something going on and just kind of playing it off as, okay, this is life. Prioritizing care of others over their own needs. So this is a huge part of what we're going to be looking at, which is how Latina mothers have this vision of family is everything, and my children are everything. And therefore, everything that I have goes to everyone, and then the mommy gets forgotten. Right? Which, as I'm speaking to this, I'm sure a lot of people are relating. Well, this is so common among all moms, but for some cultures, is a bit stronger than for other cultures. Lack of provider trust. So when it comes to social cultural factors, lack of provider trust can be due to some of historical trauma that Latino people have experienced, personal trauma that they might have experienced with providers. And then we look at limited services in Spanish. So even when we're providing professional translator services, the research shows that there is an added mistrust when there's a translator in the room. So a way to ensure that we're kind of building that rapport to increase treatment completion, if we're having a translator in, is to really explore with the person that we're working with, what are their feelings about having a translator in the room. So we understand that there's some constructs that are very present for some populations, but we have to be flexible and that everybody is very different and very diverse within their own culture, and that each individual is the expert in their culture and their experience in the world. So even though we know that the research suggests that there's a lack of trust, we really go to the mom that we're serving to explore, how are you feeling about this? How is this experience for you? How is it having a translator in the room? Which also means that we need to work with translators to educate them as to some of the complexities that might be present in treatment and to ensure that everybody is on the same page. So the stigma comes with isolation, reluctance, weakness, and shame. And then there's also this idea that to obtain mental health treatment means somehow that you're crazy. Está loca, right? So you get treatment only if you're crazy. Next slide, please. So some more social cultural risk factors can be the reason for migration. Many individuals that are arriving to the United States are coming to the United States because of some really challenging socio-political issues that are happening in the country. For example, I was born in Venezuela, and at the time that we came, there was a high level of crime, which was one of the factors why we migrated here. However, in the past 20 years, conditions in Venezuela have worsened maybe tenfold. And across Latin America, we have gangs and we have young people that are being recruited into gangs and kidnappings and just really dangerous situations that some of the people that we're working with might have been exposed to. So it's important to keep that in mind as to, what are some of the reasons why you came here, and share with me a little bit of some of the experiences that you had prior to coming here. I often talk with clients about assessing the small T traumas and also the larger T traumas. And I find that many people have very large T traumas that they consider to be very tiny. Part of that needs to be explored clinically. And part of that needs to be given the respect as every person is the expert in their own experience. So migration related trauma, gender role expectations, some of the expectations of what a male is supposed to be and what a female is supposed to be, and how a husband and a wife or a mother or a father are supposed to behave, is going to be very ingrained and very traditional in some of the people that you work with, but it's not going to be as prevalent in every person that you work with. So everybody that comes to you has their own experience of the world. Many of your clients might have some limited time due to working multiple jobs and working long hours. And this is kind of if we look at underemployment and the cost of insurances and the cost of living. This is an extra complication that might be present. All right, next slide, please. I added this quote. It's called Ponte las pilas. So if there's anybody here listening from the Latino population, you might be very familiar with this phrase. If not, it means put your batteries on, which is such a part of, this expectation that you're supposed to do everything no matter what, and you're supposed to give everything no matter what. So the world can be falling apart. But you need to put your batteries on, kind of dust yourself off, and continue. So when I think of trauma, I often use the example of we're really good at stuffing it in, dusting off, and continuing. Stuffing it in, dusting off, and continuing. And that's kind of how we move through life. So this is, I actually have this one on my website, and they say like every Latina mom has heard this from their own mothers. And so this is the beginning of something that's kind of silly and funny, but that is part of a greater, potentially more harmful way of seeing the world, especially when we look at risk factors and when we look at the complexities of what it's like to be a mother. that even when there's no perinatal mental health complications, caring for a newborn is an extremely vulnerable and difficult experience. But if you layer on top of that the belief that you're supposed to just dust yourself off, or you're supposed to find the energy from nowhere and just do what you're supposed to do, then mothers are often left to the side and forgotten, which leads to a lot of different complications, the worst of them, suicidality. Next slide, please. And so what we're going to be looking at next is Marianismo. Marianismo is a construct in the Latin American culture. It's very prevalent in some people and not so prevalent among others. It is this idea and this pressure to be perfect, to be all giving, and to be all sacrificing. So I have here being like Mary. Can we move to the next slide, please? So the word Marianismo was first coined by a political scientist, and her name is Evelyn Stevens. And it's initially rooted in Christianity. However, modern day Marianismo applies to all Latino people, and actually, I think all women, regardless of religion, because we know that Latinos come from an array of different cultures, different countries with different experiences, and also an array of different religions. So some Latinos might be Catholic, some Latinos might be non-believers, and some Latinos might be from an array of multiple religions. So kind of keeping in mind that there is that diversity there. So it's an implicit bias that tends to present itself under the disguise of norms, values, and unspoken expectations. So just like any implicit bias, like racism, we don't call it that. We don't call it you have to behave under the guidelines of Marianismo. It's more of an underlying unspoken rule or expectation. So let's explore a little bit more as to what Marianismo means and what makes it prevalent among the Latinx population. I'm hearing a little bit of background. I don't know if anybody else is hearing that. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. Yeah, I saw a comment. So if there's background where you are, it would be really helpful if we can mute. All right. Sarah, can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So within Marianismo, there's several constructs that kind of make it real or make it come to life. One of them is this belief in familismo, which is a sacrifice for the family. So as the mother, the expectation is that you are going to give every ounce of energy that you have to your family. Now, the condition here is that no matter what, you are there for your family and you give and you sacrifice regardless of whether you have anything to give or whether you have anything to sacrifice. The next is respeto, which is respect or obedience. It's also duty. It's a concern for the hierarchical structure within the family, so different dynamics. There is something that we often, or like I often grew up with, which is idea of no le faltes el respeto, like don't disrespect them. So you respect your elders, you respect men, you respect people that are supposed to know more than you. Which, if you're a woman, especially a young woman, everybody knows more than you in certain cultures. At least that was my experience. The next contract is simpatia, which is acting with really good manners, with courtesy, being ladylike, but it also means avoiding conflict. I often tell couples, if there's no conflict, it's usually a sign that one person is thinking for the both of them. So something to keep in mind, right? So if you are courteous all the time and you avoid conflict, then it means that you cannot and are not allowed to live your most authentic life, that you're not allowed to share your opinion, because if you share your opinion, then it means that you're going against this ingrained and implicit pattern of how you're supposed to behave and live in the world. Can we move to the next slide, please? So these are two oppressive and intertwined discourses. Marianismo lives inside of machismo. Machismo is that idea that that aggression that men come with. So we think of the patriarchy when we think of machismo, but an added layer of aggression and violence that often is what is the word? Kind of the way that we raise men and the expectations that we put on a society on men, and then the expectations that we put on women. That men are uncontrollable and irrational, and that women, because they have this higher way of being in the world and being all giving and all sacrificing, therefore put up with an array of things in order to make the family unit work, in order to ensure that they're giving everything that they're supposed to be given to their children. Now, research has shown that endorsement of these constructs is greatly intertwined with levels of acculturation. So the longer an individual has been in the United States and has kind of gained some of those values that are in the American culture, such as independence or feminism or being liberated, than the lower levels of Marianismo that are going to be present in their lives. Can we move to the next slide, please? So this is an exaggerated explanation of Marianismo. So it kind of describes an idealized Latina woman, somebody who is virtuous, who is spiritually superior. Because remember, if machismo is the big one and Marianismo is a small one, then it means that men are irrational and unable to control themselves, and therefore women have to be the ones to keep the family together, and that means also spirituality. Being humble, being virginal, non-sexual, self-sacrificing, honoring, being modest, submissive, and nurturing. So the context is being in the home, being in the background. And this is the way that many of us are socialized. So, for example, when I think of my experience, I never used the word Marianismo growing up. But the idea that the expectation was that I was going to be humble, that I had to be all sacrificing for my family, and also the expectation of being non-sexual. So there's a lot of shame that comes through sex for some families, not talking about it or creating shame specifically to women. So men are encouraged to have sex while women are not. And so again, present in mostly every culture, definitely present here in the United States among the majority population, but the added layer of this pressure that is present in the Latino population. So even though in the US back in the 60s, we had a big revolution and a big movement towards equality. We had those movements in Latin America, but they weren't as prevalent and they didn't stick as firmly as those changes happen here. I don't know if that makes sense, but I often use the example of this writer that I really admire. Her name is Isabel Allende. And if you haven't checked her out, I highly recommend her. And so Allende, she would often talk about feminism. And she had her TV show and she would advocate for women's rights and she would advocate for equality in the home. And in one of her last books, she writes about how even though she was advocating all this wasn't really what she was living. So the story is that her father came up to her and he said, I really admire you. I really admire that even though you're going on TV and you're talking about all these things and equality and being liberated, when you're home with your family, you do your duty. You do what you're supposed to do. And so she writes about how she was living this double life and this expectation of being humble and being self-sacrificing and being nurturing while at the same time, right, trying to be open and trying to bring freedom to a lot of women in her country. So it's kind of, something to keep in mind with the people that we're working with, that we can appear one way in the outside and be completely different in our homes. Can we move to the next slide, please? And so women's role is exclusively reproductive. And so we think of the highest calling as being a mother. And so if you keep that in mind and you think about if reproduction is fundamental, then what happens when there's an experience of infertility or when there's experiences of miscarriages? Blaming women for the outcome of the home and the family. And this idea, again, that women, because we're seeing as higher beings, then we're going to be better able to control our impulses, right? So we're observant and respectful of patriarchal systemic structures. Next slide, please. So women are expected to withstand numerous frustrations in romantic relationships because they exemplify this characteristics of patience and guidance and flexibility and all giving and all understanding. And we have in some communities or, even some older individuals that I've worked with where there has been a marriage for 32 years, 27 years. And then when you explore on the outside to everyone, this is amazing. But then you meet with the individual, with the woman, and then the story that you get is a story of, suffering and what were some of the things that this person had to compromise. One of them is infidelity, so high rates of infidelity could be present potentially. But also when it comes to sex, right? So if women are supposed to be humble, sacrificing, non-sexual, a lot of times sex is seen as a duty that you do within a marriage, whether you enjoy it or not. And it also means that there's not a lot of room for exploration of your own body and what brings you pleasure. We know that there's a lot of things that change in a relationship after birth and even during pregnancy, but more so when you're not allowed to talk about it. Because there's this unspoken rule that you're not supposed to. Because to speak about it can potentially mean that you are suspicious, right? Like, why are you bringing this up now? Next slide, please. And so there's cultural pressure can lead to internal conflict, especially as we spend a little bit more time here in the United States and as what's the expectation that's internal no longer makes sense with the reality of what's happening and what you need in your life. Adherence to traditional gender roles of Marianismo are associated with sexual health outcomes, and this is negative sexual health outcomes. One of those that the research points out is higher risk of HIV and other sexually transmitted diseases. The reason behind that is lower condom use among cultures that adhere to more traditional values, because if women are supposed to be passive, then they're not having those conversations. Intimate partner violence, and also higher rates of depression and anxiety that are present. Next slide, please. And so, as in many cultures, depression is frequently seen as a sign of weakness, of isolation, and shame. Cultural expectations of motherhood are going to create an added layer to the pressures that mothers experience. And so the next slide, we're going to look at a little bit as to like what can we do with this information, and how do we apply it appropriately, and with a sense of humility with the people that we work with. Sarah, next slide, please. Okay. Next slide. Right. So cultural humility is a term that I really like. And I like it a little bit more, or actually I like it a lot more than the idea of cultural competence. So just give you all this information about Marianismo. It doesn't mean that we're going to reach a level of competence, or that when we have a Latina woman sitting in front of us, that we're going to say, okay, you fit into this box. So competence comes with this idea that we can reach a level of knowledge that where everybody fits in. And that couldn't be further from the truth, because we all have our very, very diverse experiences in the world, even within religions, within countries, and even within families that might choose to be more traditional. There's going to be dynamics of diversity. So, cultural humility is where we as providers and advocates work to understand the cultural values and expectations that we have for other people. So instead of competence where you have me and other, cultural humility works to bridge that gap, and to create a relationship with the person, and also to explore and create a relationship with our own values and expectations. So it's an ongoing process and critical assessment of the definition. So when I think of a Latina, what image comes to mind? Even within my own culture, when I think of a Latina, what comes up for me? When I think of a person from Venezuela, what comes up for me? From Cuba, from Dominican Republic, from Mexico? Looking at what are our views and our values. What interventions are we using? And are the interventions being used in a very appropriate way to the population? Or are we trying to fit the population into the box of the intervention? How are our services being promoted to people? How are we seeking referrals? And how are we presenting that information? And what are the societal discourses? Right? What is the national discourse? What is the discourse within your state, within your district, and within your family when you think about different populations, not only the Latino population, but any a diverse group that you work with. Next slide, please. Okay. So what we do with cultural humility is that we're going to tie it in to the rest of our conversation. So I'm going to go over some protective factors. So these are what I would consider strengths. And whenever I'm working with an individual, I'm looking at what are the strengths that they possess, and how can I use those strengths that they have in order to guide them through treatment. So as opposed to focusing on the risk factors, I focus on what is it that they're bringing to the table that we can use to help them move to the next level. So definitely the focus on family and community support, compadres, which I guess they're like godparents, but very different. Compadres tend to be very involved, supporting the family and supporting the child. Um, is there a healthy interpartner relationship? Is there access to care? Is there financial stability? What is the level of education? And what is the access to social justice in the community that that person's living? And how can we connect that person to those aspects of social justice? Next slide, please. All right, so now what can we actually do? First and foremost, and all research points to this across the board with whatever diverse population you're working with. And this is to include input from the people that you're working with, from the Latina mothers during all phases of treatment. This is going to help you offset the high rates of discontinuation among my population. So this is listening and learning. So actually asking, how was the intake? Um, what did you think about this assessment? What did you think about the treatment? It might look as running focus groups if you're available to do that, or if it's possible to do that, or just that one-on-one treatment assessment. Next slide, please. Then we remain mindful of the level of acculturation that the individual's bringing, the time that they have been in the US, and then the culture of origin. And we use that in treatment to understand and to conceptualize what are some of the issues that the client is bringing or that the mommy is bringing. How can we work with them? And then we join with the client and the family. So let's look at the next slide and kind of explore what are some ways that we can join. So one is to help our families to identify the areas that they view as problematic. So we might have some ideas that we're keeping in the back of our mind as we're doing our initial assessment and assessing, okay, well, this mommy's telling me that she's doing everything and that, for example, dad has never changed a diaper and there's no other sense of support, there's no other type of support that the mom has. Keep that in the back of your mind, but you ask the parent, what do they view as problematic? Then we also explore somatic symptoms. The research points out, and definitely it was my experience and maybe the experience of many of the listeners, that Latino people, we tend to explain mental health symptoms in terms of how we feel. A very common word is malestar, which is just a sense of not feeling well, or nervios, tengo los nervios, which is like your nerves. So it's kind of exploring what are the words, what is it that they're feeling, as opposed to using the word symptom or perhaps the word depression. Just tell me about some of the things that you have been experiencing. Tell me about some of the ways that you haven't been feeling like yourself. Right? Next slide, please. The next step to that is a discussion of the actual risk factors. I'm a big believer that we collect information, and then once that report is built, we can present psychoeducation as to what are some of the things that put mommies at risk of experiencing perinatal mental health complications. So we discuss that, and then we explore with them what was their migration experience. Are they alone here, or is there other family that's in another country, that's in their countries of origin or other countries, that is that contributing to a stressor in their lives? Is there the expectation, for example, that they're going to work to provide some assistance to the family that they left behind? Or even mommies that you're coming and providing services to that just had a baby, are there other children that they are sending money and providing to that they're separated from? Because that's definitely going to create another risk factor and another layer to the experience of having a newborn. Next slide, please. And then we address the stigma. Okay? So I have some questions here that I frequently ask. and you can word them in whichever way feels natural to you. So I'm a big believer in the clinician's use of self. So use your own style while also using theory and research. Okay? So I know that there's a strong stigma against mental health in many cultures. What is your experience like? I know it can be scary to come here. What was it like for you to meet with me today? Perhaps another question is, a lot of my clients have told me that it could be very vulnerable to see a therapist or to come to a social services office to ask for help. How was it for you to be here? How was it for you to make it? How difficult was it? Was it something that you were thinking about for a long time? This is going to give you some information as to perhaps a level of stigma, but it's also going to give you some information as to the barriers that the people that you're working with are experiencing. Next slide, please. And then the next step is we identify the discrepancies between expectations and reality. And so this is a technique that's borrowed from motivational interviewing. What is the expectation that you have? And what does it mean to you to be a mom? What is the expectation that your family has? What is the expectation that your partner has? And then what is it that you can actually do? And a question that I often go back to is, what is reasonable? When you tell me that you want to do this, that you want to be the perfect mom, then we define what that looks like. You want to give everything to your children and your family, and that you want to give all, no matter the cost and no matter what, because this is your duty. Is it reasonable? And with that sense of reasonable, I go to self compassion, and many of you may be familiar with the practice of self compassion, which is this idea of thinking about yourself and talking about yourself in the way that you would somebody that you love and care about. If somebody else was telling you that this is what's going on in your life, that this is what you're experiencing, how would you respond to them? What would be the advice that you would give them? Or what are some of the support that you feel like that person might need? Sometimes framing it from how would somebody else handle it, what advice you would give to somebody else, helps to create a little bit of separation from the pain that the person is experiencing, and it helps them to be able to access those rational areas so that they can think through the trauma that they're having in the moment. Next slide, please. Then we explore how to establish healthy expectations, right? So once we look at what is not working, and how can we shift those expectations so that we can address that internalized system of oppression? What is your inner language? What does that voice inside your mind, right? And we all know that voice that comes in and criticizes you and tells you you're not good enough and that you need to do this and that and blah, blah, blah. Right? How do you learn to challenge that? How do you ask it continuously if it's reasonable? If there's a sense of limited support, then how do we work with the family to connect them with the resources that are in the community, but also to connect them with the resources that they might have available to them, but that they haven't utilized? Perhaps families, perhaps cousins, perhaps neighbors, friends. So it's about giving them strategies to build what might be considered a strength for them. Exploring social cultural needs, self-compassion, I talked a little bit about that, and also increasing parental confidence. I've found from a lot of my mommies, especially ones that did a lot of reading during pregnancy, that a lot of their preparation had to do with pregnancy and labor. But that outside of pregnancy and labor, there was not a lot of preparation for what was it like to come with this newborn and take care of it. Something very simple, night and day confusion that happens in newborns, right? Where they're waking up every so often. Many parents are unprepared for that, and the expectation is that the baby's going to sleep soundly. So providing psychoeducation so that we can increase confidence is going to be helpful. So we're challenging the beliefs that the individual has about themselves and the belief that they carry about the world. Next slide, please. So engaging fathers, engaging the extended family members, and others present in the client's life. And what we're going to do is that we're actually going to invite them to session when that's available, or we're going to reach them by phone if that's the only thing that is available for us to do. But anybody that is important, that's there giving feedback or criticizing, we want to engage them in treatment, and we want to have them join with the mom so that they can provide the support that they need. And this doesn't need to be fancy. This can be one session a month, or it can be 3 sessions back to back, or it can be a one-time thing, right? Where we help people understand what is going on with this mommy. What is she experiencing? I often find that when we provide a name to something, if we can explain perinatal mental health complications, then it gives people something they can work on. Then we explore the impact of the symptoms on the family with the goal of increasing support and balancing those social cultural pressures. So we're shifting patterns that are increasing the symptoms in the mom. So it's I think of work with a lot of my Latinx clients as action-based. How do we bring in tools that they can actually use so that they can do the things that they need to do in order to help themselves? Next slide, please. So as we're supporting the family system and the extended families, it would be useful to work with the mom or the support system on conflict resolution, on communication, problem solving, on creating a recovery plan. Right? Let's say that things are going well and mom is in maintenance. Then we want to develop a plan for what's going to happen if there's a relapse. Who is going to come in as a support system? What are the questions that we want to ask? And what kind of support will be helpful to the mom and addressing the concern? So we want to, as opposed to focus only on the mom, we want to utilize what is available, because we're using and understanding that among some cultures, family and support system is very, very important. So we're picking from their culture, right? From what's important in the Latino culture and trying to implement it into treatment, while at the same time, right, holding in mind that critical assessment of what are my views about this family. And when I'm treatment planning, am I treatment planning based on this idea of what I think a Latino family is like? Or am I treatment planning in conjunction with the mom? Right? So before you invite the father in or the family in, asking that question, like, I found that sometimes inviting the family can be very supportive in the recovery of many moms I work with. What do you think about that? What would it be like for your partner to be here? What would it be like for your mother-in-law to join us? What are some, and even role playing, what are some things that you would like to share with her, right? So that we're being considerate and that we're holding that humility in mind. And next slide, please. And now on a larger scale, we think about what are some things that we can do programmatically that are going to support our Latino community. So research shows that definitely peer-delivered models are very, very useful when it comes to working with diverse populations, specifically in communities with a disparity between service providers and the population served. So a community that doesn't have a lot of Spanish-speaking service providers, or service providers that look like the population. then perhaps building the community with something like support groups um, can be not in lieu of treatment, because when somebody needs treatment, they need treatment, but can definitely be a protective factor, and for many can be preventive. We want to offer programs that focus on maternal, child, infant, or family health. So we don't want to look at the individual alone. We want to create programs that are really going to integrate this idea of giving your family what they need and doing what you need to do for your family without losing a sense of what you need as a person and what you need as an individual. So I'll share with you an anecdote. A couple of years ago, I worked with a Latina woman experiencing a PMAD, and this was back in my hometown. And as we were working together, we decided to include the father and we decided to include the baby in the treatment. So they had this little daughter, and the father did not participate in anything. So there was no diaper changing, no feeding. I asked about bathing, and the dad almost had a heart attack because in some cultures, like the man will never give the little girl a bath. And so I had to be really creative as to how I was going to hold respect for what this family brought, hold my own biases in mind, while at the same time joining with them so that I could provide them with a tool that was going to help to support the relationship. So we did a model that's called First Play. And if you're not familiar with First Play is an intervention that uses storytelling and infant massage to strengthen the attachment relationship between parents and infants. And so it's a manualized model. And I was sharing the massage moves with the mom. So I do the massage on the doll, and the parents do it on the baby. And I tried to engage the dad, and the dad said, no, that's for women. And so where we got creative was that the baby became really fussy. And we were able to continue the massage by having the dad hold the baby while the mom did the massage. And that was the beginning of helping the dad feel more comfortable. I often say that these constructs keep women in a place of disadvantage, but they also take a lot away from men. They take the capacity to nurture with their babies, um, the permission that they give themselves to be nurturing, to be loving, and to enjoy those bonding moments. So I look for ways that are respectful, that account for what the family needs, um, but that at the same time are working to challenge what's not working, what's not feasible, because nobody should have to parent a child alone. Next slide, please. Right. And so I think this is the last slide I have for you all. And this is looking at community-based programs that boost coping and self-care strategies. So this actually came from a recent research that I found where they took a large group of Latina women and we're trying to find what were the programs that were most useful. And they found that when it came to working with the Latina population, using programs that boosted coping skills and self-care strategies. So they specifically focus on techniques of mindfulness. They had a whole mindfulness relaxation program. Was very useful in helping to build that continuity of treatment, and avoid early dropout of treatment. And so when we're looking at programs from a provider, so me as a little person working with my client, or community-wise, me as a little person working with other people on the community, trying to figure out, how do we service diverse communities, we need to really keep in mind that there is a very real history of racism and disparity and prejudice and social injustice that people have experienced. And that if we don't account for that and we don't keep that in mind, we're going to lose people. And worse than that, that if we don't account for that and keep that in mind, we are at risk of continuing to oppress people. So it's very important to practice from, whether for you cultural competence, it works for you and you feel like that builds awareness, or whether something like cultural humility speaks to you and helps you to be more aware, whatever construct you use, that you're accounting for your own biases and how we can either make the society a better place for the people that we're serving, or whether we can inadvertently make it a more difficult place for the people that we're serving. And then the other thing is to continuously build collaborative relationships. So working with each other, but also working with the clients. Continuously working on that idea of joining. What is working for you? And sometimes as providers, we could be a little scared to broach those topics because it is a vulnerable experience to ask somebody that you've been working with for 3 sessions, how are you feeling? For 3 months, for 6 months, what do you feel is working? If we can do this over, what would be some things that you would keep, and what would be some things that you would shift, or that you would say, okay, let's not do that? Because that's the only way that we're truly going to be able to practice from a way that fits the diverse people that we're working with. So we're at the 15th minute, and I think if there's any questions, I would love to take them.
This is Mia, everybody. I know that webinars can be, hard to jump in on, but if you have any questions or comments, we'd really love to hear them, and we'll give you all just another minute to think about whether you want to chime in or not.
You can feel free to type them in. And also my contact information is listed at the end of the PowerPoint. So if there is any questions that come up after we finish, or anything that you're like, oh, I'm not really comfortable to ask this question, because that can happen, especially when we talk about really vulnerable conversations, then you can send those to me. And I see a couple of Okay, so I see the first question from Catalina, and she's asking, what is your experience working with Indigenous women? Can you share some insights? So unfortunately for me, I was living in Miami, where we don't have, at least in the area that I was living, a large Indigenous population. So I actually don't have any experience working with Indigenous women, even from Latin American countries. I believe, and Mia, correct me if I'm wrong, that there's actually going to be a webinar that's specific to working with Indigenous populations.
Yes, we're going to have a webinar in March, but we'll be looking at Indigenous women in Washington State. So we won't necessarily be looking at Indigenous cultures from Central or South America.
Okay. Okay, and Catalina says yes in Washington, so that's exactly what she's looking for. So make sure to check out that next webinar. And then the next question from A. William says, can you speak more about social justice as a protective factor? Right? So when I think of social justice, I think of definitely access to care. So ensuring that services that are at a rate that people can afford them, ensuring that documents, language, the people, that everything is provided in a way that can reach people, and that we're not trying to fit people into our programmatic boxes. So I think that when we are aware of our own biases, and when we take a step and some time to assess, who is this program trying to reach? And who are we missing? Who is not coming to services? Who is dropping out of treatment? And we really need to assess, like, what are the factors that are contributing to this? Not from a they place, but from a me place. What do I need to do different as an individual provider, as an advocate, or as a program to ensure that I am practicing in a way that increases access to services for everyone, in a way that ensures continuity of services for everyone. There is an issue if we live in a community where we have a large population of, let's say, X people from this diverse group, and none of these people are coming to our organization for services. Then what's happening, right? It doesn't mean that it might be pathological, or that, you know, maybe there's an array of other services available, but chances are that there's not, because we all know that there's not enough services for all the people out there. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I really do believe in this idea of cultural humility, and really taking the time to look at me. What am I doing? How am I thinking about this? How am I coming across to my clients? What oppression am I replaying that's then increasing the oppression that people experience when they try to access services? Oh, thank you for your comment, Antonia. Alicia? Oh, some of these are like moving. So Patricia says, I wanted to thank you for including the slide about Marianismo within machismo. Like you said, as a Latina female, I never used the words to describe the experience, but rather it was implicit and learned in the culture growing up. And as a provider, being able to create this pictorial for Latin clients is useful, definitely. And you can use any of this information within your clients as a program. Because that information, when we're able to provide it, then we're able to empower. And Katie says, when you work with Latinas who started with a therapist from a different background, are there things those clients often wish their first provider did differently? Absolutely. I think the first thing is microaggressions, which are those subtle comments that are prejudice and that are racist, whether intentional or unintentional, that end up further oppressing the client. I can share with you. So we know many Latino people come from different countries. So I was born in Venezuela. My mom's Cuban, my dad's Colombian. Both of my parents were immigrants to Venezuela and then were immigrants here. And one time I had a provider tell me that I wasn't really Venezuelan because my parents were from two different places. So it's like little subtle comments can be very hurtful to clients. So I often think that's something that many of my clients complain about. The other thing is that expectation that people are just going to adjust and change without concern for what's working for the family. So every family has a right to direct their gender roles or norms, or however they define it, in a way that fits for them. So if a family is traditional, then that's traditional. That's who they are. It is not my role to come in and to try to shift it. What I'm looking is what's functional. So sometimes the expectation that if we don't check our biases, we're gonna replay them with clients. And so we might be, because we think, okay, for me, making sure that everything's equal, that's what's going to work for you. That can be feel very hopeless to somebody that's looking for services. And seeking services seems like it's easy, but it's actually quite difficult. So when we add some more difficulty by trying to implement insensitive practices or saying things without really thinking about the impact that they might have on clients, that could create an added barrier. How can you empower the mom when her husband doesn't believe in mental illness and says, "What's wrong with you? Can you get over it?" If he doesn't want to participate in therapy and he is the breadwinner. This was a great presentation, very thorough and reflective of different types of issues that affect Latina moms. I would always try my best to try to get the dad to come in, even if it's for 10 minutes before the session or for 10 minutes after the session. Use your judgment as a clinician. So sometimes, there might be abusive situations that you need to be assessing for, and there might be just like oppressive situations that are not necessarily defined legally as abuse. But I can think about one case where the dad was like super freaked out every time he brought the mom in. And so the way that we frame him, how we got him into treatment was, just come in so that you can share with me how you think the mom is doing. And so it was putting him in kind of like, you get to share with me what you think is wrong with mom, right? So it's this idea of like joining as opposed to working against, or as opposed to, I don't know, being overly pushy. I'm a little lost. Okay. It's difficult to find cultural humility. Yeah, I love that term too. Counselors and therapists from Latin communities. Aside from support and peer-led groups, do you have ideas on how to build capacity to help people understand we need more providers? There's a lot of fear from Latin communities to work with white providers here based on all the issues that we discuss. I think definitely having programs and webinars like this one are going to be the way to go, making sure that we have conversations that those of us that are here, right, like we're the ones that have to do the work. So we're the ones that have to kind of put our sleeves up and challenge systemic oppression when we see it. When we see people say insensitive, racist, prejudicial, commit microaggressions, it is our duty and responsibility as providers. And for some of us, for example, for social workers, it's written in our code of ethics that we have this responsibility to address and to teach. And then we teach whoever is willing to listen, because that's all we can do. Just like with the families that we work with, we can't force. We can't, like put it in front of them and like try to make them understand. You can't rationalize with somebody who's being irrational. So we open the room for conversation with whomever is willing to listen.
Maylene, this is Mia. I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll talk just quickly about resources, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, so the last question that I have here is from Julie, and she asked, in what ways do you use cultural and national pride to connect with and motivate clients? And so if we're talking about cultural and national pride in terms of like the culture of origin, it's really like, what is important to you? What are some values that you learned in your country, within your family, where you came from, or even from here, that you would like to continue? So it's taking like what is really happening, like, mm, yeah, like what are the values and what works for you, and kind of what doesn't. It's a similar exploration that we would do in individual therapy if we were working from, let's say a psychodynamic frame. We would explore, what are the things from childhood that are working for you? And what were those messages that are no longer working that you would like to not continue replaying? And so I always think about that working from strengths. What works? What do you like? And what feels right? And what is actually working? So thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciated your questions. If there's anything else or anything that you're like, oh, that wasn't really clear, feel free to send me an email. And I think we can, Mia, do you want to discuss resources?
Sure, that'd be fine. Great, thanks. Can
You're
you
welcome.
forward the slide, please? So I just wanted to call to your all's attention some resources in Washington State that we have for Spanish-speaking parents. So Perinatal Support Washington has a call-in warm line, and we have a staff person who is a native bicultural and bilingual Spanish-speaking provider in the community who has really a long time, a lot of experience working with families and experiencing perinatal health complications, and being able to talk about some of these hard things that we've really brought up, and talked about today here in this webinar. Things like how do you address stigma, how do you support people in getting access to mental health care, how do you find mental health care that feels like it's the right fit for you, how to work with folks who have experienced mental health care that hasn't felt supportive or culturally humble and responsive. And so it's a really great resource. Right now, families call in and leave a message. The message is also in Spanish, and so it gives them instructions, and then we call them back. We're hoping to go live and have a live call-in in the near future. We also have several Spanish-speaking support groups around the state, and you can find all of those support groups on our website, which is perinatalsupport.org. Last year, we translated our perinatal mental health wellness plan. So it's like a postpartum wellness plan for parents into Spanish, and it can be a great resource for you to work with your clients. You can give it to them, they can download it themselves, or you can do it together with them. And then lastly, for folks that don't have a lot of resources in their own community, Postpartum Support International has really wonderful, they have a Spanish landing page on their website that has a lot of information. They offer online Spanish-speaking support groups weekly, which can be a great place to get sort of support no matter where you are, no matter what you have in your individual communities. So with that, I wanted to just say thank you so much for Maylene for this wonderful presentation. This was really wonderful. Thank you to DCYF for supporting this work and helping us get it out to more people in Washington State and beyond. I think if you just forward the next slide, it has Maylene's contact info. So if you have any, if you'd like to follow up with Maylene, you're welcome to do that. And then lastly, these slides and the video will be available on the Perinatal Support Washington website, and also DCYF will also have it on their website. So you can watch it later and you can reference it as well. Anyone over at DCYF want to say anything before we wrap up?
No, I think we're good. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Great. Have a wonderful afternoon. For those of us in the Puget Sound region, stay warm and everyone get home safe today. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.